our advocacy work. So thank you very much for being with us. Okay, first of all, there's a little housekeeping. Janet has already told you that she's going to mute everybody so we don't get those background noises. And you can either have your video on or off. It really doesn't matter. If you want it on, that's fine. And as she said, the event is being recorded. And also we welcome any questions for Dr. Elizabeth Vibert. And if you have any, please put them in the chat. So the chat function is down at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and then it'll give you a place to write in your question. Okay, today this event is taking place from coast to coast to coast. We are gathered on Turtle Island, the ancestral lands of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. GRAN recognizes access to adequate food as an inherent human right. The right to food is not about charity, but about ensuring that all people have the capacity to feed themselves in dignity. For this right to be fully realized, food must be available, accessible, adequate, and sustainable. GRAN has chosen the focus on this human right for our All of GRAN campaign for 2023. This learning event is part of our Right to Food campaign. So now we'll have Phyllis introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Elizabeth Vibert. Over to you, Phyllis.
Thank you, Diane. Welcome, everyone. It is my great delight to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Vibert. She is a huge supporter of GRAN and all of our initiatives. Elizabeth has traded one coast for the other, having started her university career at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia for the University of Victoria, where she has taught in the history department since 1984. Her main research interests are food insecurity and food sovereignty, particularly in colonized spaces and in the era of climate change, colonialism, and the intersecting histories of poverty, gender, and race. She and her research partner, Basani Ngobeni, are exploring the histories of older women in the Limpopo area of South Africa during and after apartheid, which has resulted, beyond many articles, an amazing documentary film called The Thinking Garden, or Hekaletane in the local language, which is a place where women gather to think about how to effect change. Isn't that a great name? The second project is the 4 Stories About Food, which examines the causes of food crises and the powerful community responses in 4 settings: South Africa, Colombia, Indigenous communities in southern and northern Canada, one of them is very near Souk here in Victoria, and refugee communities in Jordan. A remarkable workshop in November 2019 brought members of all 4 countries to explore the various ways these communities are working for food sovereignty. Once again, Vic Grans were invited to hear these remarkable people speak, and later had the pleasure of hosting the South African participants at a party which ended in dancing and singing. As you can see, Elizabeth is a person who cares deeply about people and all the social justice areas for which GRAN works so hard. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Phyllis, and myriad thanks to GRAN and your various associates like the Victoria Grandmothers for Africa and others across the country. Many thanks for this invitation and for the amazing work that you do. I think that some of what I'll be talking about today is old hat to you folks. You're already experts in many of these areas, but I hope I'll have a few new insights to offer. I'm going to share my screen, and I have to make a sort of caveat about about this very, very extensive PowerPoint. I'm going to whiz through some of the slides without really speaking to them, but I built this PowerPoint with it in mind as a resource for your use. So I'll make it available to you as a PDF afterwards. And it's a historical resource, it's a political resource that starts you at least down some roads you're already well down, and down some new ones. Again, I'll just please bear with me if I sort of skip over slides and you feel like, oh, I wanted to read that, I wanted to see that. I don't have time to speak to all the slides, but I do intend it as a longer term resource for your use. So here we go. Is everyone seeing my screen? You may have to move the thumbnails of the speaker and others in order to fully see the screen. I always have a bit of a challenge with that myself. I end up moving my thumbnails around the screen as I go. So is everyone hearing okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I just heard some feedback. I wondered if someone was trying to get my attention. I had a meeting, a really helpful meeting with Diane and Linda and Phyllis and Joanne. I think I hit everyone a couple of weeks ago to talk about the content for this talk. And I have to admit, I was given a fairly large agenda. So I'm going to speak to a number of themes here. And I'm going to do so for the first while as a historian. So I'm going to speak to colonial pasts that have led to ongoing colonial presence and to the really urgent need to decolonize our food system. So for some of your taste, I may be a little too historical for part of the talk, but I'm doing that very deliberately because I think in order to think about how to decolonize our ways of being in the world today and our ways of eating, we have to understand the colonial pasts that brought us here. That's a quintessential historian's view. So please bear with the historian today. I do want to begin with the essential territorial acknowledgement. I'm to echo Diane's, I'm coming to you from the territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. The university is on the territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples, and adjacent to the territories of the Wasanich peoples, whose relationships with these lands remain profoundly important today. And so we now, as a matter of course that I strongly approve of, routinely make these territorial acknowledgements before we begin public events, before we begin talks. I always say to my students, it's one thing to recognize and respect. Those are important ongoing actions for us to take. What does the acknowledgement compel us to do? What does this acknowledgement compel me to do? One of the things, and this is reflecting partly on our meeting a couple of weeks ago about what would be useful material to share with this audience, one of the things that recognizing and respecting the Indigenous peoples on whose territories I'm a guest compels me to do is to continuously examine in an ongoing way the taken for granted assumptions that I hold about the world, my hegemonic views, the unquestioned, taken for granted, the things that go without saying because they come without saying, in the words of the social theorist Pierre Bourdieu. I try as best I can, and I think we all need to take up the challenge to do this, to examine the way my taken for granted assumptions about the way I move in the world and the way other people are in the world, the way those shape my social relations, shape my political views. So that's one of the things that recognizing and respecting Indigenous territories in what we call Canada compels us to do, to examine our taken for granted about why we're here, how we have the right to be here, whether we have the right to be here, how we can be good guests in these lands. And I highly recommend to you the link there to the late Sarah Robinson's Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan. This is a quick outline of what I'll speak about today. So as I've mentioned, I'm going to go historical for a bit, bring us up to the present day, and then speak about ways forward toward something we call food justice. I'm going to just gesture to the indigenous ecological systems that are in the background and need to be brought back into the foreground today if we are to move to sustainable food systems. But I'm going to speak at some greater length about the colonial and corporate food regimes that so determine our food system before coming to the happier part of the story that Diane and others asked me to be sure to reach in this talk today. So to talk about decolonization, to talk about decolonizing food systems, decolonizing the structures that continue in very profound ways to structure our society today. To talk about decolonization, we have to understand the colonial patterns and structures that brought us here. Decolonization is variously defined by all sorts of thinkers and activists. The process of undoing colonizing practices, including colonial ways of knowing, and gesturing back to the previous slide, this is a key thing for us to do in our engagements in the world. Decolonial approaches and methods seek to disrupt settler colonial logics, seek to disrupt the kind of naturalness of binaries that structure our world: superior, inferior, male, female, black, white, advanced, backward, those kind of structuring binaries that are frameworks in our minds that we need to really speak against and investigate as best we can at every turn if we are to decolonize our ways of knowing. And very happily, last month when I looked up the latest report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Michael Fakhri, I discovered that his February 2023 report is all around decolonizing food systems and looking at the colonial roots of and the ways in which colonial practices persist in our global food system into the present day. So as he puts it, today's global economy is the continuation of a centuries-long process characterized by a dynamic of dependency and extractivism, undergirded by international and national laws. So that's our heritage. That's the heritage we have to understand if we're to unmake it. In his recent report, Fakhri talks about the extent to which the global food system or systems are broken and characterized, shot through by many forms of violence, including the extractivist mindset itself that colonizers brought to the so-called New World in the 15th, 16th century, and that really still defines multinational agribusiness into the present day. So what does he mean by extractivist mindset is a systemic form of violence? Well, here he tells us, systemic violence violates the right to life by limiting or denying people access to the necessities of life, to food and the land and seeds with which to grow food, water, fair and stable markets, dignified work. When people are dispossessed of their land, when they're forced to work in hostile conditions, they're exposed to harm on a regular, ongoing basis. That's the systemic nature of violence, that systemic daily harm. This is how systemic violence makes people vulnerable and dependent and holds them in those systems of vulnerability and dependency. Now, to speak to the global food regimes in the language of some scholars, first was the indigenous ecological system that defined food systems and ecological practices for millennia. Indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of living in the world. And as Turner and Ignace point out in this quotation in the upper right, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous technologies are defined first and foremost by respect for all life forms and for the land itself. That's what characterizes indigenous belief systems. So indigenous names of plants themselves, tell stories of local ecological relationships and social relationships. So the high bush cranberry, which grows in numerous parts of what we now call Canada, the different regional names and national names of the high bush cranberry the names speak to the ecological relationships that ground that food and medicinal plant in language that speaks to multitudes and circularity and diversity and complexity and abundance, language that is less present in the Linnaean Latin naming of plants and animals and ecosystems. The colonial food regime, of course, crashed into those indigenous worlds. With the arrival of Columbus in the West Indies in the 1400s, the vision of the emerging colonial food regime, the first global food regime, was extractivism. As Columbus said, when I came to the Caribbean islands, I found people here. These were not empty lands, as Europeans would sometimes claim. But nevertheless, I took possession of them for our fortunate king, discovered all manner of unidentifiable living things of unknown value to our king. That vision of ownership, taking and extracting. And here we see it again in the language of the English explorer Humphrey Gilbert in the 1580s in invading, one might say, the territories of the Inuit peoples, seeing again the great wealth, the infinite wealth, the way to enrich the European princes, to possess the infinite wealth of this new part of the world, newly, quote unquote, discovered. And the colonial food regime saw the extraction of raw materials in the colonies and their transportation across the Atlantic Ocean to Britain and the other imperial domains, to the imperial center. And we know that story, right? African peoples in their millions kidnapped and exported from West and Central Africa to perform the labor in the Caribbean islands, in the Americas, that produced the raw materials that so enriched the European states. So the wealth produced often by enslaved African people and in smaller numbers indigenous peoples. The wealth flowed, the raw materials flowed from the Caribbean, from what became Canada, much of that labor and in the production of that wealth done by African and indigenous peoples. And then that wealth funded European armies, European economies, European merchant capitalism in ways that founded global wealth inequities in ways that are profoundly with us today. I wanted to draw to your attention the way in which the so-called European Age of Discovery created many of the hard and fast identities that we still hold today, and by which we still define ourselves profoundly today. So it was that age of discovery that created the very notion of Europeanness. And then a little later on, the national identities that would proliferate across that region of the world. And whiteness was born and profoundly underwritten during this age of discovery. So we had, obviously, before the age of discovery, the so-called age of discovery in quotation marks, we had the Christian, non-Christian binary already long in place. But alongside that, in this period of overseas imperialism, came the Western-Eastern binary, the European and civilized versus uncivilized binary, the English versus other binary, these really powerful binary ways of viewing the world, us, them, ways of viewing the world that became so powerful in the era of European imperialism. Not to say they didn't exist before, but were really entrenched in the era of European imperialism, and that remain present in our minds in ways we have to keep track of into the present. We often talk about the global food system as an artifact of the 20th century. sometimes thinkers will go back into the 19th century thinking about the global food system, but sugar, slave-grown sugar, was the first global crop. And sugar, grown in particular in the Caribbean islands, helped to fuel the wealth of European nations into the present day. Sugar helped to finance Britain's North American settler colonies, where we live, helped to finance and fuel the growth of the first industrial revolution in Europe, the British Industrial Revolution, the revolution in textiles. Of course, cotton grown by enslaved people was crucial to that industrialization as well, which I'll speak to in a moment. And the huge increases in British sugar consumption that started in the late 1700s and flourished through the 1800s and saw sugar becoming a key food for all Britons and crucial to the whole British food system. That was all on the back of the labor of enslaved people growing sugar cane in the Caribbean. Sugar really is the first global food. Sugar central to the factory workers' lunch in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Tea with sugar from the two global domains, global imperial domains of India and the Caribbean, was eaten alongside white bread grown with grain from Quebec and Upper Canada. I mean, how much more of a global food system can we imagine than this? And the wealth of the sugar didn't just fund British plantation owners in the Caribbean and back in Britain, but it funded wealth in the northern colonies as well. So some of the most impressive buildings were the sugar refineries in places like Montreal in the 18th and 19th century. I highly recommend to you, if you haven't already been seeing it, The Guardian, the newspaper, The Guardian's current series on the legacies of slavery in Britain. And we can extrapolate from those legacies to British North America / Canada in profound ways. The Guardian is currently running a daily series on cotton capital. The Guardian, of course, the newspaper itself, was founded in Manchester. Manchester was very intimately tied to Mississippi, where the cotton was grown. And research by historians who look at the contemporary legacies of colonialism has shown the extent to which the wealth of those who founded the Guardian newspaper, but also the wealth of those who were the sort of center of Manchester society came from the Caribbean, came from the labor of the enslaved. So as the journalist Gary Young has written in a recent article, the labor of enslaved people was embedded in the wealth production that made Manchester, that made the surrounding areas. It didn't just put money into their pockets, into the pockets of the millers and the merchants, but it actually was feeding the laborers as well, who were working in the textile factories. Huge fortunes, national fortunes and personal fortunes were built on that colonial slave economy. And after the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in the 1830s, the former enslavers, the plantation owners, the Brits, were awarded $20 million in compensation for the loss of their human property. That's about $3 billion in today's money. The enslaved people whose labor had literally produced all that wealth received nothing, and less than nothing. Emancipation did not create a great new world for many enslaved people. It left them on the islands of the Caribbean, landless, homeless, often destitute, and with little alternative but to turn to work for miserable wages on the former plantations where they'd been enslaved. So that's an early phase in the sort of repetition of impoverishment of free Black people in the early era of emancipation. And now today, we see a great deal of talk about reparations, about restorative justice, And we're hearing such talk from such personages as a member of the Trevelyan Macaulay family, one of the leading merchant and scholarly families of Britain in the 19th century. Today, a new momentum is building, says Laura Trevelyan, one that accepts that the wealth of European countries was built from transatlantic slavery and other forms of colonialism. A new momentum that accepts that and tries to make amends, so that recognizes and acknowledges and then is compelled to do something. As the historian of the Caribbean, Hilary Beckles, puts it, the apology is the first stage. The second stage is negotiation of how to repair that harm, restorative justice, reparations. And King Charles III himself has said, this is a conversation whose time has come. And so the groups that are advocating for restorative justice or reparations, they're not looking just for money. People often say, oh, it's a cash grab, in people criticizing this kind of movement. The work of those seeking this kind of justice, this kind of reparative justice, is grounded in an understanding that the political, the social, the economic are bound together and have to be thought through together if we are to have any hope of creating a better world. We cannot leave in the darkness the past that brought us here if we're to make meaningful social change. And I highly recommend the work of the scholar who's cited here on this slide. Sorry, I just changed the slide. Olivette Otele at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, who's written really powerful and powerfully and persuasively about the need for reparations and restorative justice. And just to finish this point about the importance of the slave economy and the broader colonial and imperial economy to our present economy, to our present food system, to our present moment. The work of the Harvard historian Tia Miles and the sociologist Matthew Desmond, I highly recommend their work to you. They offer this diagnosis in a recent article. If today America promotes a particular kind of low road capitalism, union busting capitalism, of poverty wages, of precarious work, of the normalization of precarity and insecurity, a grotesque inequalities that we see in our in income and wealth in the global economy today, stunning disparities, partly racialized disparities, then that's because, they say, that American capitalism was founded on the lowest road there is. If it's on a low road today, it was founded on the lowest road there is, which is slavery. Just to underscore the ways in which colonial ways of knowing and colonial practices remain with us today, I draw your attention momentarily to the Irish potato famine, for which the immediate cause was potato blight. The much deeper cause was long practices by English landowners in Ireland seeking to modernize and improve the agriculture of the small farmers, the Irish farmers, who they saw as encumbrances on the landscape. They saw the Irish small farmers as impediments to the march of progress and modernity, encumbrances on the landscape. And they wanted to sweep aside their unprofitable backward agriculture to make way for modern forms of agriculture. And those practices in the two decades before the Irish potato famine, which dispossessed farmers and pushed them all into potato farming, sort of monoculture, potato farming, are the background to the potato blight that wiped out so much of the essential food of those farmers in that decade. And I draw your attention to the potato famine because of the way that it's set up basic cultural binaries, but what are really moral binaries. The English landowners saw themselves and their ways as industrious, the small scale farmers as indolent, saw their ways as productive, the small scale farmers as inefficient, saw themselves as, two groups of poor people, the deserving, those who were working toward modernity, and the undeserving, those stuck in the past. Food itself was moralized in this context. Those who lived on wheat and predominantly ate wheat were the forward thinkers, were the progressive. Those who lived on and scrabbled in the ground for potatoes were the backward. And the historian David Nally, who writes about the human encumbrances that these small scale farmers were seen to be, makes this really powerful argument that connects past to present. In terms of perceptions, not much has changed since the 19th century. Dominant economic institutions like the World Bank and many governments and many government agencies still consider poverty in much the same way as the Victorians viewed the Irish. The natives are stuck in the past, fundamentally incapable of autonomous development, in need of corrective measures to stimulate social reform and promote their development. That kind of improvement thinking, modernization thinking, still profoundly influences and directs a great deal of international development work, really, across the globe today. Quickly jumping ahead from the colonial era, though we're not out of it yet, I've made that point. We come to the post-war food regime, the era of the Green Revolution, which sought to bring modern industrial agriculture, much more high yield agriculture to the global south. In particular, the US was very keen to bring these forms of modernizing agriculture to industrial agriculture to India. The Indian government at first reluctant, but then signed on. You probably have a pretty clear sense of what the Green Revolution brought. It did bring enormous increases in crop yields and an enormous narrowing down of biodiversity, among other costs. Among the many costs, in India alone, some over 100,000 varieties of rice were lost. Many of those developed over generations and millennia, adapted to local conditions like recurrent flooding, recurrent droughts, inundation by salt water. As the Indian biologist Deval Deb puts it, it took us 12,000 years to develop these diverse varieties of Indian rices. We lost them, most of them, in 30 years. And Deb goes on to speak to those colonial mindsets that informed the Green Revolution. The farmers, Indian farmers themselves, many of them, says Deb, were injected with the idea, the colonial belief, that traditional farming methods were unscientific, were anti-modern, anti-progress. Many small-scale farmers themselves came to believe in the efficacy of the high-cost, the high-end methods, with, among other costs, all kinds of environmental impacts. So when the Indian farmers took to the streets and paralyzed the region around Delhi in 2020 and 2021 in the Great Indian Farmer Protest, which we'll be studying for years to come, they were protesting against many of the long-term impacts, among other things, many of the long-term impacts of the Green Revolution, the water crisis that those methods of farming helped to create and proliferate in India, and the intersecting crises that go along with that. By the early 21st century, Punjabi farmers, who were the leaders of, but not the only participants in the Indian farmer uprisings, were facing catastrophe on multiple levels: soil death, water shortage and water contamination, rising farmer debts, and massively rising numbers of farmer suicides as a result of that cycle of indebtedness, partly owing to the purchase of expensive inputs like fertilizers and so on. That whole ecological crisis has particular costs for women, which you'll be familiar with in the African context. And the farmer uprising was carried out in these two registers, really, of improvement versus farmers speaking the language of the costs of that modernization and improvement. So the Indian government, speaking the language, the time-worn language of improvement, talked about how farmers needed to be able to compete in the private food markets, that they needed to sell their food to the big private firms rather than to state markets, which protected farmers from vacillating prices and so on. The government spoke in the language of modernizing a backward sector. The farmers spoke the language of the costs of that modernization, being left at the mercy of corporations, losing state protections, which stabilized prices paid to farmers, and so on. And they spoke the language of no consultation, which is so frequently the language of farmers, whether they're prairie grain farmers here in Canada or small scale farmers in the global south. Farmers are rarely consulted about farmers' needs. In organizations like Seed Grain and others, of course, are very focused on farmer consultation and farmer needs. But at the government level and at the multinational level, that's much less often the case. And then we come to the corporate food regime, which has been our reality since the 1980s. Built on all those currents prior to the 1980s. And then since the 1980s, what we've seen is patterns of concentration, of growing vulnerability, deepening reliance on a small number of industrially produced grains, a smaller and smaller number of countries producing the grain for the world, and we've seen the cost of that with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Smaller and smaller, ever concentrating number of corporations dominating the agri-food commodity market. The World Trade Organization, founded in the 1990s, is a symptom, and its mantra of free trade above all else, with often disastrous impacts on farmers, is a symptom of this corporate food regime, this global corporate food regime. Seeds are a really powerful symptom of our of the predominance of the corporate food regime in our lives today. Seeds are little bundles of life, now owned by, now having been made into little packets of private property in a process many of you will be familiar with. We heard a great deal about Monsanto's role in buying up the intellectual property of seeds in the 2010s. That was a very, in the early 21st century, it's a very prominent concern of those concerned about the global food system. Well, Monsanto was bought by Bayer. DuPont and Dow merged. Syngenta was bought by ChemChina, which is now Sinochem. The massive concentration, the ongoing concentration of these huge global multinational companies that own more and more of the basic kernel of life, seed, is a really profound symptom of the corporatization of our food system. Pesticides, the use of pesticides as a kind of band-aid solution for local pest outbreaks that doesn't engage in the wider ecosystem thinking that is so crucial to a healthy food system, so crucial to a healthy soil biome. So the current world food system is based on an industrial model of inputs and outputs, a financial system that views food as commodity, a view of nature based on domination and extraction, right back to our colonial roots, and a commitment, an ongoing commitment to limitless economic growth. Surely we've learned that's impossible now. Where has all this got us? A very fragile global food system, a very inequitable global economy. You see the graph on the right-hand side here showing how how income and wealth has shifted since the 1980s into the hands of the 1% and even the 0.01%, and away from those in the lower percentiles of income. This has all been part of and an outcome of the neoliberal project, which says the market will figure it all out, wealth will trickle down. This hilarious cartoon of the Reagan era actors suggesting, we'll just grow the wealth, we'll grow the economy, and the wealth will trickle down. Well, clearly the wealth trickled up. We don't need to look beyond this data of the American government to see how quickly the wealth trickled up. And the impacts in the global south of this era of the corporate food regime and the neoliberal paradigm of growth and marketization, the impacts included structural adjustment programs, which you're likely familiar with, which were imposed by the World Bank and the IMF and national governments on the global south when many global south nations fell into deep debt. The structural adjustment programs, which the World Bank itself now criticizes, had really profound impacts on the food system, on the agriculture sector in the global south. Pushing global south governments and farmers to specialize in export crops for trade in the global market, export crops like coffee and cocoa and flowers, to eliminate government subsidies to farmers. Never mind that the wealthiest farmers in the wealthy nations in the G20 are the recipients of massive government subsidies, to abandon storing food surpluses, to cancel credit programs for small farmers and education programs for small farmers. And the results of the structural adjustment programs were disastrous. Just to take a quick example from Zambia, which went through structural adjustment, followed to the letter the structural adjustment regulations and rules through the 1990s, with the result that the Zambian agricultural sector was very hard hit, and with the wider result that poverty in Zambia grew exponentially across the 1990s, such that by the end of that decade, about 3/4 of Zambians lived below the poverty line. Now, this isn't to say that structural adjustment programs alone caused this slide into impoverishment. This is the era of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and so on. Many, many factors. Historians are always careful to take into account the many factors that lead to such outcomes, but certainly structural adjustment programs and that mindset of managing global south economies for a global market contributed. You're probably familiar with this graph that shows widening rates of malnutrition since 2015, partly and until the early 2020s, heavily because of climate crisis and ongoing conflict in many regions. But in 2023, this upward climb of numbers and rates of malnutrition is contributed to, of course, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the soaring food costs and the cost of living crisis, as well as the ongoing impacts of climate crisis and so on, contributing to insecurity, food insecurity globally. You may well be familiar with this graph as well, which shows how much of the world's food is actually produced not by global agribusiness, but by small-scale farmers and smaller family farms. Sometimes we hear the statistic that small-scale farmers, how we define small-scale is debated, but often it includes farms below 2 hectares, sometimes below 10 hectares. But it's often said that small-scale farmers grow 2/3 of the world's food. That's not correct if we think of farms below 2 hectares. But if we include in smaller scale and family farms, farms up to about 50 hectares, then we can say that farms of that size and farmers working on farms of that size grow about 2/3 of the world's food. So agribusiness is not growing most of the food, most of the calories consumed by eaters around the world. Small scale and modest sized family farms are doing most of that food production. And yet in the global South, small scale farmers live a very precarious existence in many instances, in most instances. They are among those most likely to be hit by local extremes of weather and so on, and to be plunged into hunger in those contexts. So that's one of the nasty ironies of the global food system. The role of agribusiness, I've already spoken to. I'll leave that slide to you for those who want more details. And I'll very quickly walk through some final points about the crisis we're in before coming to some solutions. The water crisis, the crisis of really skewed use of resources by our overconsumption of meat. The crime, really, that 30% of food that's produced for human consumption is wasted. Think of the cost of that waste. All the water and labor and other resources that went into growing that food wasted, as well as the food itself wasted. The methane and other greenhouse gases that are thrown into the environment as a result of that waste. This slide is horrifying. We need to address global food waste and local food waste quickly. Resource inequities, which I've spoken to already. Now, food insecurity, the global food crisis, which we face today, is very much rooted in power inequities. I hope I made that quite clear with my visit to the colonial era and the birth of the global food system. And just to take an example of what I mean by this, how power relations shape food insecurity. We need look no further than the gendered inequities in our food system. Inequities that see women in many parts of the world less likely to own land than men, although not entirely without land. The women at Lekatani Garden, many of them own their households, and they as a collective own their farm. The lack of land ownership has knock-on effects: lack of access to credit, lack of long-term security. Women are the water harvesters in so much of the global South. They're the people charged with collecting water for households. They're the people most affected by drought, by loss of water sources to mining and other uses, and so on. Women's economic opportunities, the economic opportunities available to women are often circumscribed, although I really feel that we are making moves in a really positive direction through the support of many NGOs, some of them Canadian, some of them international, who are focusing specifically on investing in women farmers. Women have less access to training and education in many countries, in many parts of the world. But having said all this, having set up this sad picture of the global food system, I want to really emphasize that farmers are not victims. Farmers have answers, and farmers on a daily basis are enacting their ideas and their answers. So in response to a whole variety of proliferating crises that I've already pointed to, in 1993, the global small-scale farmer movement, La Via Campesina, was set up. And La Via Campesina is kind of like an umbrella peasant organization that has branches all over the world. The president, I believe, is still a woman farmer from Zimbabwe. La Via Campesina speaks the language of the right to food and began doing that work 30 years ago. The work of farmer organizations like La Via Campesina has been crucial in overturning, destabilizing, unsettling our very colonialist ways of seeing food systems. The work of La Via Campesina and its many, many partner and allied organizations in the past 3 decades has had a huge role in speeding the kind of food system change that we need today. Among their mottos, small farmers feed the world, small scale sustainable farmers are cooling down the earth. Those are mottos that you can take forward in your work and your advocacy with government. La Via Campesina is generally held responsible for, or a principal author of, the principles of food sovereignty, which are set out here, empowering peasant and family farmer agriculture, prioritizing local, regional and national markets over global competitive markets, emphasizing ecological, social, economic relations of sustainability, ensuring rights to land, to use and management of land, and the right to food, implying social relations free of oppression and inequality. So food sovereignty is really, the sort of agenda for food sovereignty is an agenda for food justice. Here again, the voices of farmers speaking to the problems of the Green Revolution, the problems of corporate agricultural models, and the alternative ways forward. As Canadian Farmers for Climate Solutions say, farmers are ready to take the lead. Many are taking the lead in spreading low input, low emission agricultural methods, circular economic methods, regenerative agricultural methods, but they need research support. They need government support to do that. So little research support, so few research dollars are currently spent on regenerative and agroecological forms of farming, of growing food. Much more of the research money needs to be directed into those sustainable ways of farming. And small scale farmers like this farmer, Carolina Shalele in Tanzania, are living the way forward, I think, using, so Carolina Shalele won an Oxfam Prize, Farmer Prize, and used the money that she won to, first and foremost, to regenerate her soil, to build her soil, understanding that as a farmer, that's the ground on which everything else happens. That's the foundation of all her activities. And then she paid forward, the results of that prize by hosting a radio show where she shares her knowledge and enables other farmers to share their knowledge. She says one of the only challenges that remains is people who hold the old mentality. So those kind of ongoing sort of modernizing commercial industrial farming mindset, that ongoing colonialist mindset, an obstacle to farmers like her. Another farmer in Zambia, Dorcas Lukweza, one thing I have learned that has really stuck with me: every action toward food security has to be accompanied by sustainability. Otherwise, we might be solving hunger today, but causing famine tomorrow. And here are the farmers at Tlekatane Community Garden, which Phyllis spoke about in her introduction, the farmers that I've been working with for 12 years now, who are doing very simple things, simple labor-intensive things on their farm to adapt to the ever-present climate crisis that brings them year-on-year drought, higher temperatures, so they never see anything that they would call winter anymore, and so on. The simple activity of mulching the soil to control the heat to the plant roots and to regenerate the soil. These are farmers on the ground enacting the practices that make it possible for them to continue as farmers, enacting the practices of decolonization of the farming system. Made in Canada solutions like the City of Guelph's circular food economy plan. I'll leave that to you that slide to you to look at. And I'll just make a couple of summing up points now. Some messaging that you might take forward. And I'm sure some of it is already messaging that you're working with. So I'll simply underscore the really important work you're already doing. Empowering women and youth to adopt the rights-based approaches, to work through their rights-based approaches, and encouraging government to adopt those and agencies to adopt those, can create real synergies among what I take to be the pillars of food justice. The pillars of food justice, starting with a sustainable food economy, not just meaning ecologically sustainable. That's a kind of hackneyed phrase that has, it gets greenwashed on a regular basis, but socially sustainable as well, which means dignified livelihoods, which means poverty alleviation, which means enabling and supporting farmers through their own work to mitigate, and unfortunately, as they will have to do, adapt to the climate crisis. So sustainable food security, dignified livelihoods, poverty alleviation, and climate change mitigation and adaptation as intersecting pillars of a future for food justice. And then I highlight in green some key messages here. Invest in women and youth in agriculture. Women, because when you invest in women, you invest in the community most often. That's an often shared truth. When you invest in women, you invest in an entire community. But invest in youth in agriculture. Many youth in the global north and the global south understand and are deeply concerned about the climate crisis and want to do things differently. They're really motivated to do things differently for their own future. So investing in youth with those progressive, sustainable notions of the way forward in agriculture is a really important part of our way to a more just food system. Respect and support Indigenous and BIPOC food producers and provisioners, partly because of all the ways that they've been held back and oppressed in the global food system historically, but also because those very communities are very often engaged in the protection of biodiversity, in the protection of historical foodways and food cultures, in adapting to local ecologies. So thinking about the needs and the rights of Indigenous and BIPOC food producers and food provisioners needs to be a key part of our way forward. Understanding the true costs of the food system and the need to capture waste, reduce waste, and capture it and plow it back into the food system. But being aware of the costs of the current food system, the costs including our climate crisis, our biodiversity crisis, intersecting crises with pollution, the healthcare costs of the kind of ultra-processed diet and over-reliance on one kind of wheat and one kind of maize today, and so on, and the worker abuse that's so much a cost of the real cost, often not accounted for in our food system. Reverse the kinds of concentration that I was talking about earlier and diversify the food system. Diversify, re-diversify at the farm scale, at the regional scale, at the national scale. Re-diversify crop mixes, get away from industrial monocultures. Re-diversify the soil that is so crucial to everything we do, to life going forward. And think about some of the messages of La Via Campesina and small-scale farmers the world over. Small-scale sustainable farmers are cooling down the earth. And then what can we do? We can eat for and we can vote for the kind of food system that we want. So I have been talking for probably more than 40 minutes. I'm very, very keen to hear comments and questions and hear your own ideas and your own wisdom about the ways forward toward a more just food future. And remember that listening is a decolonial act. We have to listen to farmers.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was wonderful. And Pat is going to take questions for us. She's going to be the moderator of the questions. And so I'll pass it over to Pat now.
Great.
Okay, sorry, just unmuting. Let me ask you first, Elizabeth, would you like to look at the questions in the chat, or do you want me to highlight them for you?
I think it's better if you highlight them because I'll get very distracted by the chat, and I'd rather
that's
make
great.
eye contact.
People like to do it themselves. Okay, so Tina asks, since governments often rely on the IMF as a source of funding, should we be aiming our advocacy at changing the mindset of the IMF?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I think in all of this work, we need to aim at multiple levels. So I would be aiming at your municipal government, your provincial government, your federal government, the IMF, the World Bank, all of them, international NGOs, some of whom are doing amazing work like Seed Change, an organization I'm so impressed with, and Oxfam and others, and then some of which are, you know, promoting a green revolution for Africa. Aspects of which might be a great idea and aspects of which trade in a very corporate, industrial export oriented model. So I think we have to aim all our advocacy and our work at all levels as much as possible.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to ask Emma from Seed Change if she'd like to ask her own question, since she has her hand up. So do you want to go off mute, Emma, and ask your question or make your comment?
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you so much, Dr. Vibert. Did I get your name right? Yeah, thank you so much for that really, really wonderful and thorough presentation. I also learned a great deal from your presentation, and I think sometimes, you know, we forget the very historical aspect that sort of got us to where we are right now in terms of the food system that, you know, is quite harmful to the planet and also to our health. And the other piece that, you know, in terms of food justice that at home that I wanted to maybe make a comment on is also around the migrant farm worker program that we have in Canada and the exploitative nature of that program. And the fact that I know during the pandemic, it was actually, it was highlighted a lot in terms of the plight of the migrant farm workers. You know, we were all shut down, told to isolate and stay home, but they needed to come in to literally grow and pick the food that we all needed in order to survive during the pandemic. And they were the ones that was least also thought about in terms of their own living conditions and how we can keep them safe. You know,
absolutely.
Canada. So I thought,
so in the dignified livelihoods piece, in that pillar of dignified livelihoods, absolutely the livelihoods of the farm workers, not just the farmers themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to add like one particular thing in regards to the seeds and Canada work. I don't know how many people know that, you know, in Canada, only about 10% of our vegetables and grains actually come from farmers in Canada. And to Dr. Vibert's point, there isn't enough resources that's gone into actual farmer-led seed systems work in Canada. A lot of it is very, very corporate. So in terms of thinking about ways that I think folks can be advocates or supporters, is also looking at home, because these multinational corporations basically use the same similar template from country to country. So one precedence in one country has an impact also in others as well. So I think our ability to advocate on a national level, municipal level, provincial level on some of the on some of the seed laws is also very, very important. And also our international assistant program in Canada as well is also very important. Sometimes we see it as our government, you know, just giving money to those people over there, but really it's our responsibility and our accountability as a country to also support some of that work. And it's one of the areas that Canadians always vote for it to be cut. Like right now, international assistance programs has been cut by 15%. So I think, sorry for going on and on and on, but thank you so much. I'm not a grandma, but I've enjoyed this session thoroughly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amma. And your point about the migrant workers brings to mind two wonderful papers that were in a special issue of Canadian Food Studies that a group of us co-edited, two papers by Susanna Klassen and Annalise Weiler precisely about migrant workers in Canada. So I will make those, and it's freely available. It's open source. It's an open source journal. So I'll make those two papers about the migrant worker, context in Canada, available to GRAN, and you can add that to your list. Add those to your list of resources. And on your point about, I think it was about seed research. It was about the lack of support for seed development, for seed banks, et cetera, in Canada. The really horrifying statistic was before the pandemic, I don't know if it's still up to date, that only 2% of R&D money, research and development money for agriculture, went to sustainable agricultural methods, went to like organic and agroecological farming. It was just a few years ago, only 2%. Now I know the federal budget in 21, on the advice of many farmers, including Canadian Farmers for Climate Solutions, on their advice, the federal government did put specific money toward agroecological farming, new money, but still I'm sure that the percentage that goes to agroecological methods is just a tiny fraction of the research that's done on industrial hybrid seeds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's a shocking statistic. Thank you, Amma.
Thanks to both of you. That was a really rich exchange and conversation. Thank you. Barb has a question about energy poverty, and she's asking, how can we share accumulated techniques and knowledge with local small-scale farmers about sort of new approaches to energy use? I think that's what Barb's asking.
Okay, I'm not sure I have a very good answer to that question. I can speak from the experience of the Hleketani farmers to the catastrophe of the energy crisis in South Africa right now, where they're doing without electricity 16 hours a day because of decades of mismanagement of the national, what became a corporate energy enterprise a few decades ago. So yeah, they're doing without their pumps 16 hours a day, up to 16 hours a day. So the turn, I mean, for farmers, surely the turn to renewables like solar power and wind power has to be a key part of the solution. Of course, that infrastructure is really expensive, and that's where Canadian farmers for climate solutions argument about the need for support for farmers to make that transition, which is, a green transition is partly an energy transition, absolutely. But farmers don't have the cash on hand. Smaller scale family farmers don't have the cash on hand to make that transition themselves. So they need assistance to make the transition to renewables, to get off fossil fuel fertilizers and to get off fossil fuel generated electricity and move to solar and wind. So that's probably not answering the question, but I don't think that I really am in a position to answer the question more closely than that. Apologies.
No, I think that's great, Elizabeth. And I'll just go to a question from Phyllis. She's saying, I wonder if you think that all schools in developing countries should create a curriculum to help children learn more about how to raise food sustainably. As an example, she found that few people in the areas where she taught in Africa did any composting, which is so important for soil regeneration. So should there be investments in curriculum to help change that?
I think we should have those investments in curriculum here and in the global south. In the global north, people need to understand what's entailed in producing the food they eat. I think we would, and quite a few schools are doing those sorts of things to try to introduce youth to the nature of the food system, but also to introduce them to the importance of healthy soil and all of that. So I think we need those investments here and in the global south. A big challenge, of course, is for food systems everywhere is that many youth don't see a future in agriculture. And in the global south, for very understandable reasons, many youth see agriculture as the work of the grandmothers, right? Their grandmothers. I mean, I have heard many young people say that in South Africa. I don't want to work on a farm, I want to work in an office. And that's fully understandable, inevitable, and it's also an artifact of a very colonialist view of rural life, of rural society, of farming society, that it's of the past and it's backward, and those ideas are with us still. So so in answer to Phyllis's question, I think schools everywhere, children everywhere, youth everywhere, could do with it, with education around what a food system is and how crucial it is to life, and how it's not a career or a vocation of the past, that we need food. It's not all going to be grown in labs. We need farmers. So revalorizing the agrarian and the rural in the way that La Via Campesina has done. It would be great to take that education into classrooms in the global north and in the global south.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, Diane, it's 15 after the hour. Should I be turning it back to you?
I don't see any other questions in the chat, and I think Elizabeth has done a really wonderful job of fleshing everything out for us. So perhaps we should, maybe we'll have to have a return visit of Elizabeth for even more.
I'm a little bit conscious that I went over time, and I think it's because I got so excited about the historical stuff, because I'm a historian.
We all need to have another look at that PowerPoint, Elizabeth. So I'm really pleased you're going to share it with us.
Yes, I'm going to send it to you for sure. I think because I just think I was asked to speak to decolonization and decolonial practices, and it seemed to me absolutely crucial for people to understand the degree to which the wealth of the global north is rooted in the global south. It's just so common to hear people say, we have to move on from that. Well, we can't move on from that because we live its results. We live its impacts every day. Our privilege is rooted in others' enslavement. And we can't just move on from it because we're still the beneficiaries of it, right? And others are the survivors and the victims of it. So that's why we can't move on from it. So it seemed to me really important to underscore where those calls for reparations and restorative justice are coming from. Not from people who can't move on, who won't move on, but from people who understand the degree to which we still live its legacies.
Right. So to me, it seems like that was fundamental. And there is one question, Pat. I don't know if we want to take the time to do that. Do you see?
I'm super happy to answer more questions or hear more comments. I have a little more time. So, I mean, if people need to leave, I won't be offended if you if you have to leave, but I'm very happy to answer some more questions if there are some.
Yeah, I just see Anne had put something about how do we move forward from what we're still experiencing, and I think you've provided some of the answer to that. I don't know if you have anything to add, Elizabeth.
Yes, yeah, I mean, that is the big question, right? How do we undo the colonial past, which is so present with us, right? It's its tracks, it's our habitus, it's our way of being in the world, and it's very hard to undo, and it takes a long time to undo, and it took hundreds of years to make, and we don't have hundreds of years to undo it if we're to have a livable world, right? But a big piece of what I try to do myself is to make change locally. So in my social relationships and in my in my own work. But that isn't enough at all. So the kind of work that GRAN is doing, the advocacy work that you do, where you take this messaging repeatedly to all levels of government, to the WTO, to the IMF, that's crucial. So we have to act locally and think globally, and that's a really hackneyed phrase, but we have to act globally too. So we have to try to intervene with our voices and our dollars and our understanding. We have to try to intervene in the systems that have been so deleterious, so destructive, that have destroyed our environment. And I know you don't need to hear this, because this is the work you're doing. This is the work you're doing in your advocacy. So I just want to applaud you for that, not instruct you any further in what to do. I think you're really doing it. And I'm sure many of you are trying to live it in your own daily lives as well, as best you can. I do think we have to eat for and vote for the world we want. And in your cases, it's often, for many of you, it's the world you want for your grandchildren. For younger farmers and younger food provisioners, it's the world they want for themselves as well. So that goes back to the supporting youth, as well as supporting grandmothers and women more generally, but supporting youth to make this change, to hold up their voices. And you can do that. You've got a platform. You can help to hold up the voices of younger people who haven't yet earned a platform or created a platform for themselves. I know Grandmothers for Africa has been doing work in Victoria schools, for instance, helping to give youth a platform again. So those are the kinds of things. Use your platform to help provide, to amplify the voices of others who don't have such powerful voices.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I think we'll go now then to Linda. Linda wanted to just thank you for your time with us.
Great, thanks.
Yes, Elizabeth, thank you so much. My first sentence is, wow, this has just been so rich. Thank you so much for the deep dive into colonialism, because we know the threads, but you've brought the threads of colonialism together in really around the global food system. And, that's been so helpful. I, just have learned so much. I think, as Alma has also mentioned, this has been such a rewarding time with you. That the global food crisis is rooted in power and inequities. Yes, we kind of know that, but your message, let's look at our own assumptions, because I think I've kind of just been on this journey for a couple of years now, like, what is colonialism? And, and it's really interesting, as you put on those lenses, the more and more you see, of corporate agriculture, the industrial food system. It's like, we in the West know the answers. We're going to take care of you in the South. And, so it's, but you've just brought it all together for us. So thank you very much for that. In January of this year, as Diane mentioned, GRAN embarked on the Right to Food as our campaign for 2023, and it really has been a major learning curve for us. We guess that we've kind of immersed ourselves in the challenges of climate and the pandemic and the economic crisis. Yeah, but we really are still in such infant stage in terms of understanding the issues. They are complex. But then, the messages that you provided for us, in terms of how we move forward, around sustainability, around dignified livelihoods, empowering women and youth and in a rights-based approach, investment in renewable energy, in the diversity of food systems, respecting and supporting local knowledge and local solutions, and supporting Indigenous and BIPOC food producers. Those are the messages that that we needed to hear today, and we know that we can take forward, as part of the solutions. This enormous industrial agricultural system seems to have us all by a stranglehold in some way. And yet, we do need to raise our voices that, we do need to have a sustainable food system going forward. And, it is based on a change across all of our food systems. One of the things that I've actually shared a bit with GRANs is that Global Affairs Canada is talking about decolonialization. They are talking about localization. So, they're receptive to the messages. I think the challenge for everybody is how, and the question that Anne Young asked at the end. But, I feel that we will, take these messages and work with our colleagues. So great to have Seed Change and the Stephen Lewis Foundation here today, so we can have more dialogue around, how do we put the pressure on our federal government. And of course, with the budget that was released last week, and it was just, so shocking to find that our international assistance funding has been cut. We know that there's so much more work that we all need to do collectively. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for this wonderful resource of this, these slides and this webinar, all the reading we have yet to do. I really appreciate it.
I'll send you some more reading. And I feel really remiss in not mentioning the Stephen Lewis Foundation, which of course is the umbrella under which the Grandmothers for Africa and GRAN were born. But yeah, the advocacy of the Stephen Lewis Foundation, I think it's been really profound in its support of small scale farmers across the couple of decades. It's been super important. Many of those farmers affected by the HIV/AIDS crisis and so on. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for all the work you do. I'm so impressed by all the work you do. And so thank you for the chance to speak here.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody who put this together, Janet as our host, and Pat for the questions, and Linda and Phyllis. It's been wonderful. I really want to thank all the people that are participating today and listening to this. And I just want to close with something that everybody's heard a million times, but Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world." Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Bye for now. Hope to see you again.
Thank you.